Hi, my name is Chris McDuffie, and I am very excited to talk to you today about Buddhist spirituality and 12-step spirituality, spiritual pathways for recovery and relapse prevention. I'm very happy to join you today. I'm sorry we are not meeting live in Vancouver at the 10th International Conference on Religion and Spirituality in Society. I want to thank Common Ground Research Network for inviting me. And of course, our hearts go out to all of those suffering around the world from COVID-19. And of course, our hearts and prayers go out to everybody who is assisting those in need. Let's return back to the presentation. Again, I'm Chris McDuffie from San Diego, California. I'm a chemical dependency counselor and Masters of Social Work intern at a residential treatment center called Eightfold Center. Eightfold Center is a detox and co-occurring disorder residential treatment center for adults in San Diego, California. If you'd like to visit us online, check out eightfoldcenter.com, and you can always email me, chris@eightfoldcenter.com. That's ATON center.com. I'm also a teacher on Insight Timer, the app where I have a podcast weekly show called Spiritual Sobriety. So I invite you to find me there as well. My talk today again is on Buddhist spirituality and 12-step spirituality, spiritual pathways for recovery and relapse prevention. I'd like to give you a very abbreviated version of my 2-hour presentation in the short time that I have with you today. Again, I invite you to email me if you have any questions or comments, and I hope to see all of you again at the next live conferences. Our outline for today: defining spirituality, 12-step spirituality, Buddhist approach to spirituality, and the synergistic alliance between 12 steps and Buddhism. Let's begin by taking a look at the term spirituality, since both 12-step and Buddhist philosophies are spiritual programs for recovery. In Latin, spirituality means breath or to breathe, which is the energy of life. And it's interesting to point out that in Latin, alcohol is called spiritus in Latin. From a 12-step perspective, I'd like to invite you to read Dr. Paul O's book called You Can't Make Me Angry. And in that book, he and his wife talk about the 4 dimensions of building sobriety and spiritual sobriety through 12 steps. And if you can imagine a baseball diamond, he starts off with physical sobriety, first base, mental sobriety, second base, emotional sobriety, third base, and coming home to spiritual sobriety. Of course, the goal is to use the 12 steps as a never-ending goal of cultivating physical health, mental health, emotional health, and spiritual wellness for the rest of our lives, preventing relapse and increasing our quality of life. You'll see in a moment how Buddhism is quite similar. Carl Jung was very influential in sharing his philosophy and research with Bill Wilson. And Carl Jung said to Bill Wilson, quote, "His cravings for alcohol was the equivalent of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, expressed as the union with God." And that was an important quote that Bill Wilson used in advancement of creating the 12-step program. According to Alcoholics Anonymous, spirituality emphasizes a loving union with a power greater than ourselves and God as we understood him. Remember that Alcoholics Anonymous was founded on spiritual, not religious tenets. Bill Wilson struggled with this conundrum as he took from the Oxford group their basic concepts and wrestled spirituality from religious practices. Many of the founding members of Alcoholics Anonymous fought Bill on this very issue. In the book, The 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, Bill Wilson finally states, "Maybe there are as many definitions of spiritual awakening as there are people who have had them." And I think this is a beautiful quote to show how I see 12 steps as a very liberal, progressive, big tent, almost utopic view of bringing people in to help them individually find their own true pathway of spirituality and union with others. I selected this particular AA coin for 2 reasons. One, we start to see the 3 chief tenets of 12-step spirituality: unity, service, and recovery. But we also see around there the concept of to thine own self be true. From a 12-step perspective, the suggestion would be that God, or your higher power, is the true self that you would like to model your behavior and actions upon. And of course, trauma and addiction and process addictions rob us of living a life in accordance of our true self. Again, we'll see in a moment how Buddhism takes a look at the concept of self and Buddha nature. I highlighted here for the 12 steps the principles that are embedded in each of the 12 steps in parentheses here. And I'll just read them quickly to show you how much of a connection we see from Buddhist spirituality to 12-step spirituality. Honesty, step 1. Step 2, hope. Step 3, faith. Step 4, courage. Step 5, integrity. Step 6, the principle of willingness. Step 7, the principle of humility. Step 8, the principle of brotherly love. And step 9, justice. When we're taking a client through, or an individual or sponsee through the 12 steps, step 1 through 9, ask the individual to look at the costs of not working through trauma and still being attached to drugs or alcohol, as it robs them of a chance to live according to these healthy principles and goals. As the individual turns the corner in sobriety through 12 steps and lives in the day of step 10, 11, and 12, this is the chief work right here that Dr. Paul O mentioned in his book, You Can't Make Me Angry, that talks about the first base being physical sobriety, second base being mental sobriety, third base being emotional sobriety, and home base there being spiritual sobriety. Of course, again, the goal is not to round the bases once, but to continue to manifest and cultivate out of suffering into joy and happiness. And these 3 steps are those chief guidelines of how to live each day sober as spiritual followers of the path. Notice that on step 11, the concept is using prayer and meditation. From a religious standpoint, like Hinduism, which preceded Buddhism, prayer and meditation in the West would be typically called contemplative prayer. And of course, Buddhism has a lot to say about the importance of mindfulness and meditation. We'll see also in step 12 the principle of service. And the bonding of non-dualistic love in Buddhism is certainly key to servicing oneself in order to service others as a pathway of spiritual healing. Remember that Buddha was a Hindu and Buddhism grew out of Hinduism. Ram Dass is chiefly known for bringing Hinduism and Buddhism to the West, so I chose this quote from Ram Dass. Quote, "We've gotten lost in our ego and have forgotten that our soul's motive is to merge with the beloved." That, of course, is more Hinduism than Buddhism, but you start to see the goal of religion, spirituality, Hinduism, and Buddhism as we start to now take a look at Buddhist spirituality. In Buddhism, the 3 jewels of Buddhism define the 3 chief tenets of Buddhist psychology. And it's these 3 chief tenets, called the 3 jewels, that help the individual reconcile with desire, greed, anger, and ignorance in order to get out of the suffering that causes. And again, as Thich Nhat Hanh says, no mud, no lotus. The invitation in Buddhist psychology is to release ourselves from desire, greed, anger, and ignorance in order to then get out of suffering and build joy and happiness for ourselves and others. Seen from a visual, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha are those 3 jewels. The first one, the Buddha, that suggests that a human being, a person, could become enlightened using the suggestions that he learned and taught, and that highlights that you too can become enlightened by following these same principles. The Dharma, there's lots of different definitions for the term Dharma, but chiefly it's seen as the actual teachings that the Buddha left for us 500 years before the birth of Christ, that's still rolling through today to teach us how to end suffering and create joy and happiness. Lastly, the third jewel is the Sangha. And the Sangha is the harmonious community, what we might call in AA, the fellowship. Thich Nhat Hanh said that the next Buddha would likely be the Sangha Again, showing the power of the family and the community of spiritual union that is the most powerful. Actually, the Buddha was asked of the three jewels, which is the most important, and he promptly said the Sangha. If we look at the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which suggests the concept of Buddha nature, it says, quote, "O nobly born, O you of glorious origins, remember your radiant true nature, the essence of mind. Trust it, return to it, it is home." Here we have the image of we are all born with this Buddha nature. We are all born with light and purity and joy and health and happiness. And that regardless of our socioeconomics, etc., we are all born with this true Buddha nature. The 12 steps, for example, help the individual uncover and discover that they were living a life that acted upon in violation of what might be called in Buddhism their Buddha nature. 12 steps in Buddhist psychology, again, remind the individual that he can come back to living a life in accordance of their true nature of love, compassion, and joy for themselves and others. Spirituality in action, 12 steps in Buddhism. AA's step 12 states, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we try to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. So Buddhism and 12 steps are action-based spiritual programs. We're using the suggestions from 12 steps or the suggestions from the Buddha in order to practice prayer and meditation, for example, in order to have a healthier self that we can then bond with others in love and compassion. In Buddhist spiritual practices, the desire to help others arises in us through meditation and mindfulness practices. In Buddhism, it's the non-dualistic union that is the most powerful source to create the feeling of joy and happiness. When the Buddha was enlightened, he then began his teachings, and he summarized his lessons into what's called the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth he suggested is that life does include suffering. The second noble truth says he uncovered the origin and source of this suffering, and it's our own desire, ignorance of the craving and attachments that actually create our own suffering. So you can imagine, for example, if somebody is craving and attached to drugs and alcohol, and at the same time ignoring or rejecting therapy, help, coming to Eitan Center for help, the individual will only increase their suffering. The third noble truth the Buddha pointed out is, here's the good news. We can actually end our suffering anytime we want. And he suggested we do that by following the fourth noble truth, which is called the Eightfold Path, or you'll see it known as the middle path or the middle way. The Buddha had a lot to say actually about alcohol, and his rules were very clear, particularly for monastics coming, for monks and nuns coming to live in the monasteries. I thought it would be interesting to point out his feelings about alcohol. He said alcohol and intoxicating liquors are completely forbidden. And he said, again, 500 years before the birth of Christ, that the use and abuse of alcohol leads to diminishing wealth, increased quarreling, a whole range of illnesses, ill repute, physically exposing oneself to others, and weakens the intellect. In short, he said alcohol clouds the judgment. And in 12-step spirituality and Buddhist spirituality, we certainly don't want anything that impedes our ability to be mindful and have clouded judgment. The Buddha used the wagon wheel as the icon to teach his 8 suggestions of the fourth noble truth called the Eightfold Path. And it's important to point out that, like in 12 steps, Buddha said these are suggestions. He said, these worked for me. See if they work for you to help you create a life of less suffering and more joy and happiness. If we take a look at the wagon wheel, we'll see that the words start with the concept of right. Other synonyms you may see in Buddhist texts are words like right or wise or skillful. That suggests that there is an opposite. So of course there's a right view and a wrong view, or a wise view or an unwise view, or skillful or an unskillful. So 12 steps in Buddhist psychology help the individual become clear-minded in order to see their actions in real time and choose a path of right, wise, skillful decision-making. If we organize the Eightfold Path in their true headings, you'll see that the three chief spiritual pathways of the Eightfold Path are wisdom. The first two Eightfold Path suggestions, right view and right intention, are the wisdom components. The second is moral commitment, which helps the individual practice the vision of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And the third chief component of the Eightfold Path is action. Those three are right effort, right concentration, and right mindfulness. I'd like to stop there because we have a short window of time together today. I invite you to email me, chris@eitoncenter.com. Follow me on the Insight Timer app, my show called Spiritual Sobriety, so that we can talk again. I wish you all the very best, health and happiness. Thank you.